7 a.m., March 19, 1945, 50 miles from the Japanese coast. A single enemy dive bomber drops through low clouds and releases two 500-pound armor-piercing bombs onto the flight deck of the aircraft carrier USS Franklin. Within seconds, 31 fully fueled and armed warplanes explode into fireballs. The ship transforms into a floating crematorium. 807 men will die in the next 8 hours. But this story is not about how they died. It is about the decision that put them there, and the impossible choice one captain made that turned the most catastrophic carrier disaster of World War II into the greatest survival story in naval history. The Franklin's fate was sealed long before that Japanese pilot ever pulled his release lever. It was sealed at 7 a.m. when most of the crew was eating breakfast below decks instead of manning their battle stations. It was sealed by a single command given just minutes earlier by Captain Leslie Gehres, a decision born from exhaustion, tactical calculation, and perhaps a dangerous underestimation of an enemy already written off as defeated. Between midnight and dawn on March 19th, the Franklin's crew had been summoned to battle stations 12 times in 6 hours. 12 times, the alarm bells screamed through steel corridors. 12 times, 3,000 men scrambled to their posts. 12 times, radar contacts appeared and vanished. 12 times, nothing came. By first light, Captain Gehres made his choice. He downgraded the ship's alert status from Condition 1 to Condition 3. Battle stations were secured. The exhausted crew could finally eat, sleep, rest. The gunners remained at their posts. Everyone else dispersed. 5 minutes later, the Franklin began to die. The first bomb punched through the wooden flight deck and detonated among rows of Hellcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers packed wingtip to wingtip. Each aircraft carried a full combat load: rockets, bombs, machine gun ammunition, and aviation gasoline measured in hundreds of gallons. The explosion created a chain reaction of incomprehensible violence. Aircraft were hurled into the air like toys. Some tumbled overboard. Others disintegrated into shrapnel that scythed across the deck at supersonic speeds, shredding human bodies and igniting everything combustible. The second bomb penetrated deeper, smashing through the flight deck and exploding in the hangar bay where even more aircraft waited. The confined space magnified the blast. Steel bulkheads buckled, men vaporized. The hangar became a furnace. What happened next defied all engineering predictions. 31 armed and fueled aircraft began exploding in sequence, each detonation feeding the next. 1,000-pound bombs cooked off in the heat and blew holes through reinforced decks. Rockets ignited and screamed across the hangar like horizontal meteors, punching through bulkheads and igniting new fires in compartments that had been untouched seconds before. Ammunition belts for .50 caliber machine guns began cooking off, spraying bullets in every direction inside the steel coffin of the ship. The temperature in some compartments exceeded 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Steel turned red, then white. Aluminum melted and ran like water. The Franklin listed 13 degrees to starboard. All radio communications died. The ship went dead in the water. And she was still only 50 miles from Japan, closer to the enemy homeland than any American carrier had ventured during the entire war. If you're finding this deep dive into naval history valuable, hit that like button and subscribe to Orders of History so we never lose these stories to time. There are thousands of decisions like this one, buried in declassified files and fading memories, and we're committed to bringing them back. But to understand why this decision mattered so much, you have to understand what the Franklin was doing there in the first place. And you have to understand the man who commanded her. Captain Leslie Gehres was not a typical carrier commander. Most carrier skippers in 1945 were Annapolis graduates, men raised in the officer class from age 18. Gehres was a Mustang, former enlisted, a man who had earned a reserve commission during World War I and clawed his way up through a naval hierarchy that viewed him with suspicion. He was a hard man, a rigid disciplinarian. When he assumed command of the Franklin in February 1945, his first words to the crew were not encouragement. They were accusation. The Franklin had been hit by a kamikaze 3 months earlier. 56 men had died when the suicide plane crashed through the flight deck into the galley. When Gehres took command, he told the assembled crew that those deaths were their fault. They had failed to shoot down the attacker. They were incompetent, lazy, negligent. He promised to fix them. The words landed like a physical blow. Men who had just lost friends, who had scraped charred remains off bulkheads, who had fought fires for hours in hell-like conditions, were told they had killed their own shipmates through incompetence. When the Franklin sailed to the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard for repairs, hundreds of sailors deserted. Some believed the ship was cursed. Most were running from Gehres. By the time the Franklin steamed back into combat in March 1945, she was undermanned and her crew was divided. Some respected Gehres's iron discipline. Many despised him. But on March 19th, none of that mattered, because the only thing standing between total annihilation and survival was Gehres's refusal to surrender. The explosions did not stop. For 8 hours, the Franklin convulsed with detonations that shook her 27,000-ton frame like a terrier shaking a rat. Every few minutes, something new exploded. 5-inch anti-aircraft shells, depth charges, torpedo warheads. Each blast tore new wounds in the ship and killed more men. The initial explosions had severed the water mains needed to fight fires. The damage control teams, the specialists trained to save ships in crisis, were mostly dead. Electrical systems failed throughout the vessel. Many compartments went pitch black. Ventilation stopped. Smoke filled passageways and settled into every void and corner. Men trapped below decks had 3 choices: burn, suffocate, or drown. Hundreds jumped overboard. They leapt from the flight deck into the cold Pacific and swam toward escorting destroyers and cruisers that raced to help. Some were blown off the ship by explosions. Others were ordered off by officers who believed the Franklin was doomed and wanted to save who they could. Admiral Ralph Davison, whose flag flew aboard the Franklin, transferred to the destroyer Miller and made a quiet suggestion to Captain Gehres. Abandon ship? Gehres stood on the bridge, surrounded by fire and smoke, and looked at the admiral. He said no. There were still men alive below. If he abandoned ship, if he gave the order to scuttle, those men would die when American torpedoes broke the Franklin's back and sent her to the bottom. Gehres refused. Davison left. Gehres stayed. And then something extraordinary happened. Lieutenant Donald Gary was an engineering officer who knew the Franklin's layout better than almost anyone aboard. When the bombs hit, he was on the 3rd deck, deep in the ship's steel guts. He heard screaming. 300 men were trapped in a mess compartment filled with smoke. The exits were blocked by fire or wreckage. Panic was setting in. Men were beginning to suffocate. Gary told them he would find a way out. Then he disappeared into the smoke. He groped through dark, debris-choked passageways, feeling his way past twisted metal and flames. The air was toxic. The heat was unbearable. Explosions shook the bulkheads around him. He found an exit. And then he went back. 3 times, Lieutenant Gary returned to that smoke-filled compartment. 3 times, he led groups of men through the choking darkness to safety. He did not leave until the last man was out. Then he organized firefighting parties and led them into the inferno on the hangar deck. Then he descended into the No. 3 fire room, where temperatures had driven every other sailor out, and raised steam in one boiler. His actions saved 300 lives and restarted the Franklin's heart. Father Joseph O'Callaghan, the ship's Catholic chaplain, was a Jesuit priest and former mathematics professor. When the bombs hit, he moved through the chaos with unnatural calm. He administered last rites to dying men. He organized firefighting parties. He personally led sailors into ammunition magazines and gun turrets where live rounds were cooking in the heat, ready to explode. The men removed the shells by hand, passing them in human chains, and threw them overboard. O'Callaghan led teams down into smoke-filled corridors to reach the ship's main magazines. If those exploded, the Franklin would disintegrate. They used fire hoses to cool the bulkheads and prevent the ammunition from reaching detonation temperature. For hours, he moved through fire and smoke and explosions, encouraging men, organizing efforts, saving the ship one crisis at a time. Both Gehres and O'Callaghan would receive the Medal of Honor. They were not the only heroes that day, but heroism alone does not explain how the Franklin survived. At 10 a.m., 6 hours into the catastrophe, the heavy cruiser Pittsburgh managed to secure a tow line to the crippled carrier. The Franklin was still burning, still exploding, still listing dangerously to starboard. But Pittsburgh began dragging her away from the Japanese coast, away from the bombers that kept trying to finish her off. American fighters shot down every Japanese plane that approached. Escorting destroyers and cruisers threw up walls of anti-aircraft fire. The enemy tried repeatedly to sink the Franklin. They failed every time. And then, as the sun set on March 19th, something impossible occurred. Engineers fought their way into the boiler rooms. They found one boiler still operational. By 10 p.m., they had it running. Steam built. Turbines began to turn. The Franklin's propellers bit into the Pacific. At 6 knots, the carrier began moving under her own power. By noon the next day, the tow line was released. The Franklin was making 18 knots. On her own, with fires still burning. With a 13-degree list, with most of her systems destroyed. She was alive. The Franklin's journey home covered 12,000 miles. From the waters off Japan to Ulithi Atoll. From Ulithi to Pearl Harbor. From Pearl Harbor across the Pacific, through the Panama Canal, and up the Atlantic coast to the Brooklyn Naval Yard. 12,000 miles on a ship that should have sunk. For most of that journey, fires still smoldered in compartments too damaged to fully extinguish. The dead were still being recovered from the wreckage. The Franklin listed and wallowed and groaned, but she did not stop. When she arrived in Brooklyn on April 28, 1945, shipyard workers stood in silence. They had never seen anything like her. The Franklin was the most heavily damaged aircraft carrier to survive World War II. 807 men died. Another 487 were wounded. The total casualties approached 1,300, second only to the battleship Arizona at Pearl Harbor. But she did not sink. The aftermath was complicated. Captain Gehres created something he called the Club 704, an organization of men who had remained aboard the Franklin during the crisis. He refused to recommend anyone outside that club for awards. He accused men who had jumped overboard of desertion, men who had leapt into the ocean to avoid burning alive, men who had been blown off the ship, men who had been ordered to evacuate. The Navy eventually dropped all desertion charges. The public controversy grew. Gehres never received another command, but he was promoted to Rear Admiral, and he did receive the Navy Cross. The crew of the Franklin became the most decorated in United States Navy history. 2 Medals of Honor, 19 Navy Crosses, 22 Silver Stars, 116 Bronze Stars, 235 Letters of Commendation, 1,100 Purple Hearts. The ship was decommissioned in 1947 and sold for scrap. But her story survived. So, what do we make of Captain Gehres's decision that morning? Was it negligence to downgrade alert status after 12 false alarms in 6 hours? Was it reasonable fatigue management for an exhausted crew? Or was it overconfidence, a belief that Japan was already beaten and posed no real threat? We will never know for certain. What we do know is that when the crisis came, when every rational calculation said the Franklin was doomed, Gehres refused to quit. His leadership style was toxic. His treatment of the crew was often cruel. But when it mattered most, he would not abandon his men. And those men, despite everything, saved their ship. Not because of Gehres, not in spite of him, but alongside him in the smoke and fire and impossible chaos of March 19th, 1945. Did you know the Franklin came within 50 miles of Japan, closer than any other American carrier in the war? Share this story with someone who needs to hear about impossible survival against overwhelming odds. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Gehres's position that morning? And subscribe to Orders of History, because we're dedicated to preserving these moments when single decisions changed everything. 807 men died on the Franklin, but 2,000 lived. And that burning ship, against all logic and engineering principles, crawled 12,000 miles home and refused to die.